Dad, you're playing too long. It's our turn.
Really, a power cable across the living room the entire time. What's going on? My name is Ed, and this is 50% Awesome, where we don't believe in perfectionism, but we do highly encourage awesomeism. I've always been a huge fan of things that have more to them than meets the eye, whether that's a cassette tape that transforms into an alien and humanoid robot of destruction, a bed that lifts up to reveal storage inside, or my last project, compact cabinet that turns into a motorized sit-stand desk. If you haven't already, feel free to check it out. I recently watched a video from I Like to Make Stuff where he built a hidden in plain sight cabinet that converted into a 4-player arcade machine, and I absolutely fell in love with the idea. While his cabinet hid the arcade controls, the game consoles and TV screen were still out in the open, and that just wasn't feasible for my spaces at home. So I opened up my laptop to get to searching for ideas, and that's where I got the idea for this coffee table. So this video is going to be the first part of a 2-part series for this build, so be sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to be notified when part 2 does go up, probably a week from when I post this video. So with my limited skills, I figured a simple box or test design for the table would be best. So I came up with this design in Tinkercad, and it fully utilizes just a single sheet of plywood. This was the perfect time to test out my new Kreg rip cut, which allowed me to make super straight and most importantly consistent cuts with my circular saw, since I don't have space for a table saw. After doing the initial rip cuts and with the help of my super not ghetto stop block system, I cut the pieces down to the proper length on my mitre saw. The trickiest part of these initial cuts is the section where the TV would be mounted, since I needed to get 2 additional pieces from that inside cutout scrap area. I marked off and drilled holes in each corner big enough to fit my jigsaw blade, which I then used to make the cutout. Since the rectangular scrap piece definitely wouldn't have straight or square edges, the rip cut wouldn't help me here, so I needed to switch out to my old reliable homemade DIY circular saw cutting guide. If you're wondering what kind of guy paints a circular saw cutting guide, even though it'll for sure be chipped up and abused, it's the same guy that puts sparks on his circular saw cutting clips. Oh yeah. With a scrap rectangle nice and square, I switched back to the Kreg rip cut to make sure that my remaining cuts were precise and, again, most importantly, consistent. I decided to try my hand at using some iron-on edge banding to cover up the plywood edges and make the visible pieces appear more like solid wood. This was my first time using this stuff, and it was pretty straightforward. To clean up the edges, I first tried filing them down, but that wasn't very effective as the glue kept gunking up the file. Don't get me wrong, it did the job, but it was a bit too much effort for my taste. A chisel worked much better for me in the end, even though it came with the risk of gouging the wood. But let's be real, I'll find a way to damage my pieces regardless, which is exactly what happened when this piece fell on the table to the concrete floor of my garage. Because of that, some slight modifications had to be made for my original design. With that settled, I took some 1-inch pieces of scrap plywood and screwed them into the inside walls of the box to act as support for the floor that I'll be putting in later. Maybe you've seen this method used before to glue up a box with mitered edges. You basically tape the pieces together on the outside, put your glue in at the joints, and then the tape holds everything together while the glue dries. So I've mentioned that I don't have much space many times before, and after calculating how long of a cleared off area I would need, well, it just wasn't gonna happen.
Nope.
So I thought to myself, this is just a simple box though, right? Should be easy enough to just slap down the glue and clamp everything down, right? Right?
Bueller.
Why did I have to do mitered edges on a supposedly simple box? So the next few minutes were full of chaos and panic while I went from corner to corner adjusting my clamps while trying to keep the whole thing square and level. I also used way too much glue and it started getting absolutely everywhere. I ended up using a wet rag to try and wipe off the excess, but man, that was way too much glue. When the glue dried up, I went to check the squareness of the box one final time, and to my relief, we were all good.
Little did he know the pain that was to follow.
The one cool trick I ran into to lessen these small gaps on mitered corners is to take something with a round edge, like this screwdriver, and work it along the 2 sides of the gap. Much better. I knew there was going to be a bunch of glue spots that I had to take care of, but they were hard to identify with the naked eye. So I used a wet rag, and that helped a ton in allowing me to see and mark off the areas that I need to give special attention to. Now time for everyone's favorite, the sanding, which took extra long because of all that glue. I also wanted to make sure I didn't sand too much, as the top maple veneer on this plywood was super thin.
One eternity later.
Color, I'm using this Greystone water-based stain from General Finishes. I applied it, but when I went to wipe off the excess, my heart absolutely sank. There were still a ton of glue spots, and they were literally all over the entire piece. I'd already spent a ton of time sanding, but the glue just seeped into the wood fibers thanks to my frantic glue up, so I had to resort to scraping to be able to remove it all. Ah well, life is a learning process, so I took a different approach when it came to gluing up the top. Even though I didn't use the tape method to put together the box, I went ahead and taped off all the areas where the joints would be located. It took some time, but I'd much rather spend it here than sanding and scraping the glue off later. I drilled pocket holes in the top piece to be able to attach it to its sides, and then it was time for glue up round 2. Because I had the top piece, I was able to go slower and do one side at a time. I used these pocket hole clamps to keep things in position, then went ahead and started driving in the screws. The tape definitely did what it was supposed to do here. After attaching the second side, the glue squeeze out was dry enough for me to remove the tape. I wanted to make sure I did this before the glue dried too much to the point where it would be tough to remove. Since the glue was still pliable, taking off the excess was a cinch. But with newfound relief and confidence, I went ahead and attached the 2 other sides and clamped everything together. Cleanup was again a breeze. At this point, I wanted to verify that the top and bottom pieces matched, and that's when I came to a realization. Instead of putting together 2 separate pieces, I should have just made one box of the final size and then cut the top straight off of that. Ah well. I went ahead and filled up the gaps with wood filler, then it was time for more sanding, which I took a little too far in the corner. Ah well. Now it was time to apply the stain, which I kind of let dry a little too long before wiping off. Ah well. Then reapplied the stain to my now scratched up bottom piece, and naturally it was still super splotchy. Feeling super dejected, I remembered something that a wise man once said.
We don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents.
But you know what wouldn't be a mistake? Hitting that like button, subbing to the channel, and clicking the bell icon to be notified when I post new content, including part 2 of this build. It would just be a happy accident. I decided to fully lean into the scratchy splotchiness as if it was intentional and go for a more rustic look. To complete the effect, I decided to use a whitewash solution that I made of an equal part white paint and water. After giving it a good mixing, I used a rag and applied the solution just like you would apply stain. It got a bit chilly in my garage, which of course eventually caused the camera lens to fog up to the point of no return. In the end, I was super happy and relieved how it all turned out. To finish it off, I applied this water-based satin top coat, again from General Finishes. This is another skill I need some more practice with, but at least I could say any further issues were totally intentional to, achieve that rustic look. After letting the first coat dry, I lightly sanded with a 220 grit sandpaper and gave some edges a little bit more attention to make some actual intentional flaws. When done, I wiped away all the fine powder from sanding, but then I discovered this. Part of the maple veneer had actually bubbled up. Ugh. I wasn't sure what to do about it other than curse Home Depot for the crappy product. Seriously, there were a ton of voids in the inner layers and a lot of issues with the veneer, thankfully mostly on the scrap pieces, but still. Since I just used iron-on edge banding for the first time, the concept was still in my head. Maybe I could use an iron to heat up and press down on the area, hopefully melting down some of the glue to keep that bubble down. I made sure to use a rag to protect the top of the table and iron away. Thankfully, this actually ended up working. You can see a dull spot from where the bubble was at just the right angle, but it's definitely been flattened, and a second coat of top coat would take care of the dullness. Not sure if it mattered, but I added a quick coat of top coat to the inside of the top piece, even though technically it wouldn't be visible anyway. With most of the main simple table construction behind me, I could move on to finally making my arcade controller. I learned some basic Fusion 360, which is another 3D modeling program which you can actually use for free with some limitations. It's still a relatively simple design, but I did make sure to have the front support about an inch shorter than the back so that the controller would have a more authentic arcade slope, which ended up looking like this. To make rounded edges, I grabbed whatever I could to trace out a rounded corner, in this case a vacuum hose adapter, and then cut off all 4 corners with a jigsaw. I also used a roundover bit on my handheld router to soften up all the sharp edges of the top. Armed with a printout of my Fusion 360 design, I went ahead and transferred that to the actual plywood slab. When it came to the actual button and joystick position, I used the design more as a guide, but made adjustments based on how it would actually feel. After marking the center of each button with a center punch, I brought out the portable drill guide and started drilling out the holes with a hole saw bit. To have a cleaner cut, I only drilled partially through on the first side, but enough for the bit to poke through the other side. I then flipped over the piece and used that hole to finish drilling through on the other side. Around 40 holes later, I'm somewhat questioning my decision to make this a 4-player controller, and I just imagine the glory of 4-player Simpsons action, and it motivates me to press on. Unfortunately, motivation doesn't improve your skills, and I accidentally drilled one hole too close. It doesn't seem like much, but unfortunately it's enough to make the actual buttons overlap when installed. But this wouldn't be 50% awesome without a mistake, or 5 or 10, but the important thing is how you move forward and deal with it. What I ended up doing here was grab a scrap piece from one of the holes I'd cut out previously, along with a steel stick epoxy putty from JB Weld. This stuff has saved me a few times before, so I cut off a small piece and got to mixing it per the instructions. With the two parts mixed together nicely, I went ahead and smooshed it onto both sides of the hole, as well as the scrap piece itself, to make sure I could get a snug fit when fixing the pieces together. The putty stays pliable for around 5 minutes or so I made sure I had good coverage all around. With the epoxy set, I went ahead and fixed the mistakes of my past. Only all mistakes were this easy. After scraping and sanding the area down, you can see just how much I shifted the button over, as it looks like there's around double the gap when compared to before. Since I'm using a relatively thick 3/4 inch plywood, I made some recesses for the joystick boxes so that they could be closer to the top of the controller, allowing more of the joysticks to come up higher. And this is where I found out about yet another oversight. When I designed the controller, I only accounted for the actual joystick top that you move around, totally not thinking about the fact that there would be a huge honker of a box underneath that would be attached to. Yay! I took out my frustrations on this innocent piece of wood, and I thought, hold on a sec. I could use that. Yeah, that might work. So you may be thinking, how exactly is this controller going to integrate into the table? Given how the project was going so far, I figured it best not to over-engineer, so I decided on cutting pieces of 2x4 to attach to the table base, which would act as simple supports, and then a couple of plywood bars would rest on those supports to support the controller. To make sure the bars would be locked in place, I cut notches into the tops of the 2x4 supports, using the bars as a guide for width. I snapped the supports together and ran my circular saw multiple times over the area I wanted to cut out. I then knocked out the remaining slivers with a chisel and ran the circular saw through a couple more times to clean things up. I cut similar notches on the bottom of the controller supports so that the controller would be able to lock into the bars as well. So back to lengthening the controller base. I decided to distribute the lengthening pieces on both sides of the base instead of just on the one side. I'll use wood glue and brad nails to attach the extender pieces, then attach these metal corner braces to give the whole thing a bit more rigidity and support. While it's not ideal, it definitely gets the job done. I filled in the nail holes and crevices with wood filler, then had another bright idea. Since I intended the controller top to be slanted, I busted out the angle grinder with a sandpaper attachment to grind the front and back pieces of the controller base to match the slope of the sides. Then I realized I was grinding the wrong side, so I flipped that piece over and pretended that nothing happened. Looks decent enough, just ignore that bottom part. I felt that I must have been pretty tired and should stop soon, as I was making way too many careless mistakes. I just wanted to do one last thing before that though, and decided to drill the pocket holes that I'd be using to attach the controller base to the top. I should probably screw those on the inside of the base rather than the outside, eh? Yeah. Time to stop. Including this video, which again is part 1 of 2 for the build. I'll post a link for part 2 when it's ready, as well as the links to everything I used in this build in the description down below. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. Everyone says that because it truly does help out a lot, especially for a small channel like mine, and it would be much appreciated. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.